Tonight, a quiet but decisive shift took place in the global economic system. What happened in Venezuela was not framed as an emergency. There was no dramatic announcement and no formal declaration of rupture. But beneath the surface, several mechanisms that have governed international power for decades stopped functioning the way they used to. This was not an isolated move. It was not symbolic, and it was not accidental. Over a very short period of time, three pillars that normally operate together were disrupted simultaneously: the US dollar, the flow of oil, and the enforcement of sanctions. Individually, each of these elements can absorb pressure. Systems are designed to bend, but when pressure is applied to all three at once, the system is no longer bending. It is being tested. That is what makes this moment different from previous crises. Venezuela did not issue threats. It did not escalate rhetoric. Instead, it altered how transactions were executed, how energy was redirected, and how financial constraints were practically bypassed. These were operational changes, not political statements, and that distinction matters, because systems of control do not collapse when challenged verbally. They collapse when they stop working in practice. What makes this event particularly significant is the timing. These changes did not occur in isolation, nor did they emerge randomly. They unfolded while global markets remained open, while enforcement structures stayed formally in place, and while official narratives suggested stability. Yet on the ground, functionality shifted. No alarms were triggered. No immediate countermeasures followed. But the effects began to register almost immediately in trade flows, energy routing, and financial behavior. This report is not about speculation or prediction. It is about understanding what has already happened, how it unfolded, and why its implications extend far beyond Venezuela. Because what took place tonight was not a local adjustment. It was a signal, and signals like this are rarely ignored. To understand why this moment matters, it is necessary to separate narrative from mechanics. What occurred in Venezuela was not announced as a single decision. There was no headline stating that the system had changed. Instead, a sequence of operational measures began to appear almost simultaneously across financial, trade, and energy channels. First, dollar-based transactions tied to key sectors were effectively frozen. This did not take the form of a public ban or a dramatic decree. In practice, payment pathways using the US dollar stopped being processed in the usual way, forcing transactions to move through alternative settlement structures. At the same time, energy flows began to shift. Oil exports that traditionally moved through routes aligned with dollar settlement were quietly redirected. New intermediaries appeared, new payment arrangements were used, and existing contracts were adjusted without public renegotiation. This was not a shutdown of production. It was a redirection of function. Third, and most critically, the enforcement of sanctions began to lose effectiveness in real time. Sanctions depend on compliance mechanisms. They require financial choke points, insurance restrictions, shipping oversight, and payment clearance controls to operate together. What became evident over the last hours is that several of these enforcement layers stopped aligning. Ships moved without interruption. Cargoes were insured. Payments were cleared through alternative channels, and transactions that should have triggered automatic restrictions continued without visible obstruction. This did not mean sanctions were formally lifted. On paper, they remain in place. But enforcement is not defined by policy documents. It is defined by execution, and execution shifted. What is important here is speed. These changes did not unfold over weeks or months. They appeared within a compressed time frame, suggesting prior coordination rather than spontaneous reaction. There was no visible scramble, no confusion in logistics, no disruption in supply. Instead, systems adjusted smoothly, as if contingencies had already been prepared. From the outside, markets appeared calm. There were no immediate spikes that captured mainstream attention, but beneath that surface stability, transactional behavior had already changed. This is how structural shifts often begin. They do not announce themselves loudly. They register first in logistics, in settlements, and in routing decisions that most people never see. By the time headlines catch up, the mechanics are already in motion. What happened in Venezuela then was not a declaration of independence from the system. It was a demonstration that parts of the system can be bypassed without collapse, and that distinction sets the stage for what comes next. To understand why these developments matter, it is necessary to look at how the system is designed to function. Global economic pressure is not enforced through a single instrument. It relies on a structure where multiple elements operate together. The dollar provides the settlement layer. Oil anchors demand for that settlement. Sanctions act as the enforcement mechanism. Individually, each component can absorb disruption. Currencies fluctuate. Energy routes shift. Sanctions are adjusted. But the system's strength comes from synchronization. The dollar works because energy trade reinforces its use. Energy leverage works because financial clearance supports it. Sanctions work because both the currency and the energy infrastructure comply. What happened in Venezuela disrupted that synchronization. When dollar settlement pathways stopped functioning as expected, transactions did not stop. They moved. When energy flows were redirected, supply did not collapse. It adjusted. And when sanctions failed to interrupt those processes, enforcement lost its practical effect. This is the critical point. Sanctions do not collapse when they are challenged politically. They collapse when they are bypassed operationally. In this case, all three pillars were stressed at the same time. Not sequentially, not gradually, simultaneously. That changes the nature of the event. A system can compensate for the failure of one component. It cannot easily compensate when multiple core functions stop reinforcing each other. This is why the response so far has been restrained. There is no immediate lever to pull, no single pressure point that restores alignment. Financial systems are still operating. Energy markets are still supplied. Legal frameworks remain formally intact. But the cohesion between them has weakened. This creates a different kind of instability, not the kind that produces instant collapse or dramatic headlines, but the kind that forces silent recalibration. Institutions adjust quietly. Market participants change behavior incrementally, and enforcement mechanisms become selective rather than absolute. What makes this moment particularly sensitive is that it exposes a limit. It demonstrates that economic control is not binary. It is conditional. It works only as long as all components remain mutually dependent. Venezuela did not dismantle the system, but it revealed a fault line within it. And once a fault line becomes visible, it changes how every actor evaluates risk. This is why observers in other regions are paying close attention. Not because they intend to replicate the move immediately, but because the precedent now exists. A system that can be bypassed in practice, even partially, is no longer absolute, and that realization is already influencing decisions well beyond Venezuela. At this stage, the question naturally shifts from what happened to how it became possible. Events of this scale do not unfold in isolation. They require capacity, coordination, and most importantly, alternatives already in place. This is where China and Russia enter the picture. There were no press conferences, no public declarations of support, no explicit statements framing the situation as a geopolitical confrontation. Instead, what appeared were functional signals. Payment mechanisms aligned with non-dollar settlement were already operational. Energy transactions found buyers, insurers, and transport routes without interruption. Logistical processes moved forward with minimal friction. These are not reactions that can be assembled overnight. China, in particular, has spent years expanding parallel financial infrastructure. Clearing systems, bilateral settlement agreements, and commodity trade frameworks were designed to operate independently from traditional Western channels. Russia followed a similar trajectory, accelerated by years of sanctions pressure. Energy exports, shipping arrangements, and insurance structures were adapted to function under restricted conditions. What became visible in the Venezuelan case is that these parallel systems were not theoretical. They were ready. There was no scramble to improvise alternatives. Transactions continued with an efficiency that suggested prior testing and planning. Importantly, neither China nor Russia needed to actively intervene. They did not need to announce support or escalate diplomatically. Their role was passive but decisive. By simply allowing existing mechanisms to operate, they removed the enforcement leverage that sanctions depend on. This is a critical distinction. Power was not asserted through confrontation. It was exercised through availability. When alternatives exist, pressure loses its effectiveness. This approach also explains the silence. Public alignment would have invited escalation. Operational alignment achieves the objective without triggering immediate response. From a strategic standpoint, this is a low-visibility, high-impact maneuver. It shifts behavior without forcing reaction. and it places the burden of response on systems that are already struggling to maintain coherence. What Venezuela demonstrated was not unilateral defiance. It was compatibility with an emerging parallel order. China and Russia did not flip a switch publicly, they had already built the switch. Venezuela simply used it, and that is why this moment resonates beyond the immediate actors involved. Because once such a pathway is shown to function, its existence cannot be undone. When examining events like this, it is important to ask not only how they happened, but why they happened where they did. Venezuela was not a random choice. From a strategic standpoint, it presents a unique combination of conditions that make it an ideal testing ground for systemic shifts. First, Venezuela has operated under extensive sanctions for years. Its economy has already adapted to restriction, isolation, and limited access to traditional financial channels. This means the cost of deviation is lower than it would be for a fully integrated economy. Second, expectations are already compressed. When a country is heavily sanctioned, markets assume limited functionality. Disruptions do not trigger immediate panic because instability is already priced in. This creates a controlled environment in which alternative mechanisms can be tested without drawing disproportionate attention. Third, Venezuela sits at the intersection of energy and geopolitics. It possesses significant oil reserves. Energy exports remain strategically relevant, and yet its access to mainstream markets has been constrained for years. This creates a scenario where energy flows must already navigate complex logistical and financial pathways. Adding alternative settlement mechanisms does not introduce chaos. It simply alters routing. Another factor is visibility. Moves made in Venezuela are often dismissed or underreported internationally. They are frequently framed as isolated or idiosyncratic. This reduces scrutiny during early implementation phases. From a systems perspective, this is advantageous. It allows functionality to be proven before broader attention is applied. There is also a psychological dimension. If a heavily sanctioned country can maintain operational continuity while bypassing key enforcement mechanisms, it challenges assumptions. Not through rhetoric, but through example. The message is implicit. If it can work here under these conditions, it can work elsewhere. This does not mean immediate replication. It means feasibility has been demonstrated. And once feasibility exists, the strategic landscape changes. Other actors do not need to follow immediately. They only need to observe. They evaluate risk differently. They reassess dependencies. They reconsider exposure. This is how systemic change propagates, not through declarations or alliances, but through proof of concept. Venezuela functioned as that proof. It showed that an economy, even under pressure, can operate using parallel structures without triggering collapse. That is why this case matters beyond its borders. It establishes a reference point, and reference points, once established, do not disappear. They inform future decisions, even when they are not publicly acknowledged. At this point, the focus shifts from the event itself to its implications. What happened in Venezuela does not automatically trigger a global realignment. There is no immediate collapse, no single moment where the system visibly breaks apart. That is not how structural change works. Instead, the effects emerge gradually, through adjustments in behavior rather than announcements. The first response is observation. Governments, institutions, and market participants watch closely. They examine whether alternative settlement mechanisms remain stable. They assess whether energy flows continue uninterrupted, and they evaluate how enforcement bodies respond or fail to respond over time. This period of observation is critical. If functionality holds, confidence grows quietly. If disruptions remain limited, risk calculations change. The second response is selective experimentation. Countries with higher exposure to sanctions or financial pressure may begin to test similar mechanisms on a limited scale, not publicly, not universally, but in narrow channels where failure carries manageable cost. These tests are rarely announced. They appear in contract structures, payment clauses, and routing decisions that remain outside public debate. The third response is normalization. Once alternative pathways are used repeatedly without consequence, they begin to lose their exceptional status. What was once considered a workaround becomes an option, and options reduce dependence. This does not eliminate existing systems. It weakens exclusivity. From a market perspective, this creates fragmentation rather than collapse. Multiple settlement frameworks coexist. Energy trade becomes more flexible. Enforcement mechanisms become uneven. The system continues to function, but with reduced coherence. For policymakers, this presents a challenge. Traditional tools rely on predictability and alignment. When behavior diversifies, leverage becomes harder to apply uniformly. For markets, uncertainty increases. Not because supply disappears, but because assumptions about control are no longer guaranteed. What makes this phase particularly important is that it unfolds without urgency. There is no crisis forcing immediate resolution. There is time to adapt, recalibrate, and reposition. But adaptation cuts both ways. Those who adjust early gain flexibility. Those who delay may find options narrowing. What began in Venezuela does not dictate outcomes elsewhere, but it alters expectations. And in global systems, expectations shape behavior long before policy changes occur. This is why moments like this matter, not for what they destroy, but for what they quietly make possible. What took place in Venezuela does not represent the end of the global system, but it does represent a visible stress test. For decades, economic control has relied on alignment. Currency dominance, energy trade, and enforcement mechanisms functioned as a unified structure. As long as that structure remained cohesive, leverage was predictable. What this event revealed is not collapse, but limitation. It showed that control is not absolute. It is conditional. It depends on participation, compliance, and the absence of viable alternatives. Venezuela did not dismantle the system. It demonstrated that parts of it can be bypassed without triggering immediate failure. That distinction matters, because systems rarely fail all at once. They weaken gradually as assumptions change and behavior adapts. This is not a moment for panic, nor is it a moment for complacency. It is a moment for attention. Shifts like this do not announce themselves loudly. They register first in trade routes, settlement choices, and enforcement gaps that most people never see. By the time consequences become obvious, the underlying adjustments are already complete. What happened here will inform decisions elsewhere, not because it demands imitation, but because it expands the range of what is considered possible. And possibility is the foundation of strategic change. The system did not collapse overnight, but tonight it cracked in public. And once a crack is visible, it cannot be unseen.